I grew up I was born and raised in Kenya, and I come from a family that has a very interesting constellation of life, because my grandfather from my father's side was a freedom fighter. He was incarcerated for 7 years during colonialism, and when he was set free, then he had to raise my mother and her family, and of course these are the beginning of the traumas that these traumatized people started raising traumatized children. And after independence, I have seen, of course, with the politics in everywhere, who takes the power and who decides what. Because people like my grandfather also were unfairly treated. The people who were incarcerated are not the people in power. So this still brings a question of democracy, of everything. And growing up in the capital of Nairobi, then we become like children who are beginning to live a life of a mixture of, how do I say, different tribes. Kenya has over 47 tribes, and these tribal aspects also bring differences from the time of independence and power sharing, and this also affects the politics in our country. So having grown up in the city of Nairobi, I would say I was privileged to live in a cosmopolitan city, so this aspect of tribalism did not get into me. And this is part of my socialization, that I do not look at people for who or where they come from, but for who they are and what they stand for. On the other side of my father, my grandfather from my father's side worked in the time of Barclays Bank, which was such a white bank to be in the capital of Nairobi, but of course it was to serve the bourgeois and the colonialists. And these two conflicts of grandparents was a very interesting, also not difficult and important part of me to understand how the conflicts within families begin from the socialization of how people grow up. And then now comes the independence. Our parents, for example, my mother is born within the time there was a colonization, so she has never lived a life before colonization. So she wouldn't know how it was to live before the colonization. And even telling her to decolonize her mind, she doesn't understand to decolonize to what. And it's such a big, it's different aspects of points in life that formed the person I am today, that I question everything that, to question everything that is being spoken about. I come from a family of 6. My brother died like 10 years ago, this month, 18th of June. So we are women, We are 5 girls. And I have seen how society, because of patriarchal, looks at women and how harshly women are judged for whatever things that happen in their life, not wanting to understand the socialization of this person. And from this aspect of growing in a very patriarchal society, then as women we begin to think something is very wrong with us, until you begin to step out of this patriarchal and really look at it as a common enemy. Otherwise we are stuck in this patriarchal without understanding why things are happening the way they are happening to us. So My grandmother on the other side, my mother's side, she worked for the colonialist, and she had all this concept of the way the white people worked, because working for this kind of a family then, she had to conform to some form of whiteness. Not in that sense of whiteness, but everything she did was for the white people. So she kind of got trapped where her husband was fighting for the independence, and she was working for the colonialist. And this really, these small bits affects a family, because everybody's standing for different things. She needed the money to raise her family. My grandfather had to be in the forest. But the impact and what comes out later, it really affects families. So when we speak about colonialism like it was many years ago, I'm speaking about my grandparents, and how with this kind of traumas, they had to raise mothers, my mother, then who raised us, and then struggling with a very patriarchal society. So this is part of the background I come from. I will not get so much into how I came or why I came, but I came for the fact that what the media projected, that Europe was a very democratic country. And having come from these traumas I am talking about, I felt there was a need to migrate to also liberate myself from all these things that I thought I was fleeing from. Only to come here and face another different form of life. You know, the shock you get when you realize the people who are on the front, who are so good in the PR of talking of democratic countries and rights, are the most serious abusers of the same rights. And this is the situation I found myself in. So I had the choice was either to go back and continue fighting from Kenya, or come here and start to do what I have always known is rightful to do. A lot of things are changing from even where we are coming from. There is a big process of decolonization from the 72 years of British rule. And it's a process, because like I was saying, my mother was born with this time of colonization. So when you tell her to decolonize, she's like, I don't know any other way of life. So people have gone back to the way things were being done. It's quite a process of decolonization. And in this context, we are also defying these definitions that were brought to us through languages that are not our languages, and we have to conform to these definitions. So it's a whole part of decolonization that is ongoing, and it's quite a process. So as much as this information was not there years before, for example, with this death of George Floyd, I have seen countries in Africa protesting. So of course there is information how other people are treated in other countries. So this I would give a very good example of the effect of, for example, social media and how information is transformed to project the truth, because we know what with the PR, with how white countries project themselves, then we are saying, okay, it's not the way it is. I cannot be able to define the amount of shock I had when I came to this country. Just to understand, because you come with one visa, how difficult it is to change to another visa, and you have to give reasons why all these reasons why you had to flee. With the history of the colonizers from my country, having invaded our country and every right and extorting and everything, and yet here I come as a single person who doesn't have any wrong intention. I have to go through this verification to say who I am and why I have to be here. I found that really like, what is this? And I was I was very privileged to be part of this Oranienplatz movement, and the things that at the time we were fighting about was the Residenzpflicht law. And this Residenzpflicht law was, when I listened to this Residenzpflicht law, it triggered the stories I had from my grandfather with the detention, the incarceration, and how they were treated. It is exactly the same. So coming to a country and being in the society that has to compel you to live in this kind of same laws, of course it triggered something. I had to resist. I'm not going to live in this kind of situation. So being part of an Oranienplatz movement was the most, that was the biggest sense of belonging that I felt at the time. Because then there were issues that I could ask and get questions, get answers from people who are also asking themselves the same question. But then again, just to understand with this Residenzpflicht law, in comparison to other countries, how Germany is said to be supporting refugees, which it does. But why, when you think about how they impose on these kind of laws, is to control people, is to put people in a certain situation that you forget yourself and why you are here, and keep you in a limbo between the Ausländerbeholder, the Ausländerbeholder, the Sozialamt, and where you're living, and not make a life of your own. And what was so important in Oranienplatz is for people to understand this structure was something that was very well, it's a very well-formed structure to put people in this limbo. And the fact that people wanted to break it was something very important, that to free themselves and to denounce. With the Oranienplatz movement, it started with a march from people from Würzburg, from an Iranian man who had committed suicide because of the living conditions of the shelters. And the decision to walk and break this Residenzpflicht law was one of the biggest political statements that I would say the people who started the walk made. And on arrival here at Oranienplatz, then it brought different people to this space, because then we were able to understand that there were other people who have been fighting the same fight for many years. For example, from the Voice, the Caravane, they have been fighting, women in exile have been fighting the same fight about refugees, and that this was only another continuation of the fight. But what was so important with Oranienplatz is the fact that it brought to our attention that there were other people who are fighting, like the Turkish community who came here as migrant workers, and the Vietnamese also came as, the guest workers and the contract workers was something that was an eye-opener. And the solidarity that we got from Oranienplatz was from everywhere. It brought different people from different points of the world to this space. And for me, that was democracy. Being united by a call and bringing people from different walks of life for one call and supporting one call. To me, that is the face of democracy. And then with the occupation of the school, for example, because then here was a very male-dominated space. And coming from a point where I understood patriarchal, I was not sure how I was going to position myself in this kind of a fight, and I wanted to be part of the fight. So with the occupation of the school, then came the decision to have a women's space. Of course, it was a struggle to start a women's space, because then within a movement, you're accused of breaking a movement, even though you only want to address the issues that are affecting women within every context, within the movement, within the government, within the families, you know. And being in the school also gave me the possibility to be what I wanted to be. Initially, it was a space for sleeping. Everybody was going there because the Oranienplatz was supposed to be the fighting ground, but the school was supposed to be a sleeping space. And with this moving to the school, then we had also the Roma families who were living on the bottom floor from us. There were so many people from different places. And we started with a sleeping space. And then we started something that we used to say Beratung, and we were giving the Beratung even though we didn't really understand this concept of Beratung, but we had counseling. It was not counseling, but we were providing information to refugee women who are coming, for example, from Brandenburg, to facilitate information on where they would find lawyers and, you know, but we called it Beratung. It was not a Beratung. It was just that we were visible on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for any woman coming in, and we could volunteer any information that we had and we wanted to share. So the women's space had a sleeping space and they had the working space. And from this working space is when then we decided to start addressing political situations. And it also brought different types of, it brought women from different parts of the world. It brought up so many things that had to make us broaden our political sphere, not only think of the fight of Oranienplatz as a context, but to broaden the whole women's struggle. And we were in the school for 17 months. Of course, there was the decision to make the eviction. And then there was the resistance, the 9 days on the roof, which for me was such a political action. And it was so intense because the thought of the police coming to make one quick action and evacuate everybody, turning into 9 days, was something I was so glad to see how desperate the police became. This, you know, made me know there is power in people, regardless whether they have papers or they don't have papers. And this is the democracy I'm talking about. And to see the solidarity that came from the neighborhood and other people, and the civil disobedience I saw in that time, for me, that was the most honest fight. Yes, we had German collaborators. For example, the lawyers we started working with from the school are the same lawyers we work with up to today. There was a lesbian, there are so many different lesbian groups that really supported us. Of course, these groups belonged to the German women. This was a lot of support that they knew how to organize in their own country to create this, to enable us have these spaces also. And as I said, that's what also brought women from different parts of the world together. And we started to understand the dynamics of the politics that affect us from our countries of origin and the countries that now we are going to call our home. It depends on who is migrating. Because when the colonizers came to our country, nobody asked them who they were. They had the audacity to leave their own countries, come and exploit our resources, incarcerate our people, and nobody was able to question. My grandfather had to be part of the people who were fighting to take these people, to take back what is their own. And we also see the context of a European migrating or going to our countries. It's either a tourist or an expatriate or. But the minute other people migrate from the global south or other countries, then there has to be either a refugee or migrant, guest worker, contract workers. You know, these divisions is what really was annoying. The pretense of democracy and rights, that the impressions we get when we move here is also an abuse. Because then you have to take time to sit back and breathe and think again how you're going to start to fight or how you're going to exist in this country. And when you think about the conditions that have been put in place for people who are migrating from the global south to be able to get their permission to stay in this country, is very abusive. You know, in terms of changing your residence from whatever it was to getting a residence to stay here, you either have to get married or have children. And these are very abusive ways of changing a status. And the question then comes again, the people who made these decisions to have this kind of laws, they were not making these laws for their own people, they were making laws for other people coming. Where were the human rights when they were doing this kind of laws? Is there not any other way people can change their status? And who said we need permission to stay anywhere? While when the Europeans decide to migrate, they don't ask anybody for permission. These powers in the passports is what we are also trying to denounce in a very political way and say there should be freedom of movement for everybody, regardless. And the fact that the exported class that European enjoys is still as a result of continuous exploitation of resources from our country, they should sit back and ask themselves if they are being honest. If I would say what concretely was achieved from the Oranienplatz movement, even if we keep going back and forth, the Residenzpflicht was abolished as a result of people organizing themselves, even though it comes back after 2015. The voucher system was abolished. These are achievements that people need to really say, yes, as a result of people organizing, things were achieved, things changed. Then the possibility to study the German language. Now it's easier for these integrations course and dot courses. It became easier for the people now who came after. If you look at the point of the work permit that we were fighting for at that time, now after you enter this country and you are not on a Dublin, then after some time you have a right to apply for the work permit that we are fighting. So yes, there is change. And we need to stay on that position that change comes and we have to be consistent, and everyone has a responsibility to bring the change that we want to bring. International Women's Space is a group of, is an organization. Now we are an organization. We were just a grassroots group that started from this Oranienplatz movement. So as a result of this Oranienplatz movement also, there has been so many political groups that emerged from the Oranienplatz movement. And each group is fighting for something different. And for us, it's so important to take these spaces, because the more spaces we take now, the more, we can evaluate the growth of a community. And International Women's Space started from the school, and it started from the basic point of starting to address the issues of women and why they flee or whatever situations they are with, just because they are women. And even in the context of the movement that we were fighting here, the sexism already was a problem that we were trying to, say, hey, we are fighting together, but there is this problem we need to speak about. There are things people flee from, like forced marriages, female genital mutilation, religion, war. And in that time, there were less women who were migrating vis-a-vis now. And most women were migrating alone. So you find that a woman leaves their country and comes here is on their own, and you have to face this country, face the laws without being able to speak the language. And the importance of bringing these women together to form a community is something that we always try to do. Create our own communities that we can speak the German language in a broken way and nobody starts to question or look at you in a funny way, like, you know, to start to understand what the law of the land dictates and how we translate these laws of the land in our own understanding. Because even to start reading the laws of the land in the language is impossible. Even the Germans themselves say we don't understand what this is about. So for us to reevaluate and see where we stand in a community, in a country that has no rights for us, is what International Women's Space is really basically about. To understand ourselves and speak to ourselves and understand what you are facing is also what I am facing, but then we have been so categorized. If we don't get out of these boxes of guest workers, contract workers, migrants, refugees, LGBTQ, we will not understand the political dynamic of the oppressions that we all face from a system. That's the most important thing that International Women's Space does. The second is also to document our struggles, which is very important for a minority, that we can leave our history behind, and when other people continue to struggle, because these struggles will continue even in 100 years, that people can look back and say, I can refer to this. There is a certain group of people who are also struggling this many years ago. So that when people come, they don't think they are starting the struggle anew. That they understand, like the way we were able to understand from Oranienplatz, that there were groups that were fighting before. The only challenge is that there was nowhere you could get this archive of this struggle of these people who are struggling. So somehow their struggles were erased. And it's something we cannot bring back. It's really sad. And to respect that people were struggling many years before. So for us, even the documentation is something very important. That's why we have come up with these publications. The other thing is for the new people coming, we are able to tell them, okay, you have arrived in this country. This is how it functions. To demystify the complexity of the whole structure. That to put it in the language that we can be able to tell our own people when they arrive here. This is so important because then they are able to understand from our experience and our understanding, which of course is going to be there, it's going to apply to them. So it's also very important to give spaces to women who have no spaces at all. Because then we are able to include the inclusion of the new people coming, everybody who is coming, that they have a space, that they would say, okay, I have questions. So when they come, we already have formed such a broad network of organizations. We have networked with so many organizations that we always, and we already have like solutions or recommendations for particular struggles of women. Like now we have with the lawyers, for example. And there are so many things that are so important, even along the asylum process, that the state should provide this information in languages that people can speak. And it fails to do that. In the beginning, we were a group that even nobody knew about. And over the years, even though we did not have the language, we can say we have found a space. This is a change. And this it depends on what people look for as changes. But for us, this is a space, this is a change. That from an occupation from the school, we can be able to say we are in a street somewhere in the middle of Kreuzberg. It's taking up spaces. And I don't know how people visualize change, but for us, we are already taking the spaces that are necessary. And the fact that now we are part of this society, how we influence, the influence that we have, the work that we do, and people realize, okay, there's a lot of shit that happens in Germany. And we can refer to a certain group who is doing that kind of work. This is already a point of reference. And people should not look at change from a very big perspective. You have to look from the process. And when I look at, for example, the direction things are going with the demonstrations that have been there since the George Floyd death, this is change. If people do not see this change, then I don't think people will expect any other change. It is huge, it is massive. People are denouncing a lot of things. When I look at the human chain that was there last Sunday with the Unteilbar, and that the migrant community had their own blocks, I don't know what other change the society wants to see, but we are having effect. We are changing. Whether people acknowledge it or don't acknowledge it, change is there. Even though it's in small bits, it is there. I think the most important thing we are trying to say to the German community is that this notion that German is only white is a lie. This is the first lie they should acknowledge. This is a lie. Because there is a history of migrants who've been migrating, the contract workers and the guest workers. These people have been here since 50 years. So it's a lie. Germany is no longer white. And the minute they understand this, then when they make laws, they will include everybody. This is what we are trying to say. The other thing is that the racism that we speak about, it's not our work to teach people about racism, because we are saying the Europeans, they are all racist. The degrees, it's the degree, they have internalized racism that they have to, it's so much internal. But it's not our work to teach them to decolonize their mentality. We are only saying, we are only pointing out this is not what, this is wrong, and we cannot deal with this. So it's such a process. And as much as we are organizing as a community, we expect that every European, every white person should understand they have a civic duty to accommodate and include the people who don't look quite like themselves. This is the society we are trying to fight for. When we talk about what is happening in this country, people say, I didn't know. Now you know. Now you know. It's our work to say, there's a problem here, and there's a difference when you say, you acknowledge, now I know. You no longer have that excuse of saying, I didn't know what was happening. Now you know. What are you doing about it? And there is change, maybe because now there's a new anti-discrimination law. Is that not change? So change should be seen in very different perspectives. Yeah. And with the corona reports, for example, we had started a project in the international women's space. There is a BIG, Break Isolation Group, that is a project within international women's space. And the aim of this very particular BIG group is to get the women out of the homes to join, even though we know how difficult it is to politicize women. But for them to understand when they want to organize politically, there is a space that they can do that. We already have at least a structure. There is a possibility to do that. And we had started a project in the beginning of February of visiting the homes, the reception centers and the homes. So this is something we were doing as the way it is, the breaking the isolation, and we were taking ourselves to these shelters. Then came the corona. And you know, with the corona, there was the aspect of the lockdown. How do you lock down people in the asylum who are already locked down by themselves, by the state? So for us, there was double isolation for people who are living in the homes. And it meant them disappearing from the face of everything that was happening even during the pandemic. And all the contacts that we had established by going to the homes and the reception centers, we had to tell these women, now you have to be reporters. Otherwise, we cannot come because the law denies us the ability to come, and you cannot come to us anymore. But we need to table what is happening to you from wherever you are. And people do not understand privileges because these people living in the refugee camps, with the lockdown, it was even very difficult to get internet. There is no Wi-Fi, there is no VLAN in the camps. And then there was the lockdown. During this pandemic, people were told to buy food for 2 to 4 weeks. How are the women or the people living in these homes, were they supposed to be able to store foods in a room where they are living 4 people? A room where you even barely have space for yourself. And we have always seen in such scenarios, there are always the marginalized people who are never included in the changes that are being done. And in a situation of a pandemic, even the process of the lockdown and what people are required to do, I can tell you for free, the people in the home were the last people to receive this information. And we had to, make it public. There are other people who need to understand what's happening. So when you talk of a country being democratic, I don't see any democracy in Germany. Because as long as somebody is living in this country, they are part of this country. And the laws should include these people. And as a community that I am coming from, where we are not, what I want to say is that whoever people are, whether they're refugees, migrants, or whoever, those boxes people want to put people in, we belong here. We know we are not accepted, but people should swallow the fact that we belong here. They cannot erase us anymore. So this is a change people have to accept or leave it. Yeah, this was our first publication. When the question kept coming, why did you come to Germany? And we thought, okay, this question has come so many times and we need to have a political answer for it. That anybody who starts to ask someone, why did you move to Germany? Then they should read the stories of these women from different parts of the world to understand why women flee. And we saw the difference this publication made for us, because then people had something they could, they could refer to. So this was our first publication, and it started when we were in the school. During the eviction, this is what we were doing as women who are living in the space. This is a continuation of the stories of women, and it says we exist, we are here. And this one is of women who are already organized from their countries of origin. That people don't ignore the fact that when people come here, they had a life before moving to Germany, for example, that they were organized from wherever they were coming from. That when we arrive here, we do not want to be seen as victims. We want to be seen for who we are and what we have been doing all our lives. And how we are supposed to be seen as victims is something we want to denounce, because the minute you make a decision to get away from whatever form of state you are in and was making you uncomfortable, the decision to leave is a political thing that people need to understand what it is to be political. The minute you denounce and say, I'm leaving this country because of A, B, and C, it's very political. So once we arrive here, and people have come to this country through different ways, some came through the Mediterranean, some came, arriving in a country and people thinking you are a victim, this is crazy. So these stories tell how women have been organizing from their own country. And this one is the third one, Als ich nach Deutschland kam. But this was a conference that we organized in 2017. This is where we included the black Germans who are always asked where they really come from, even though they were born and raised here, which I find absurd. And that's why we are making a very clear statement that Europe is no longer white. It has other people who live here, and they need to acknowledge that. And this came also from the questions that we had, the differences we had from the school when we had women from the East and the West coming from very different perspectives, and for us to understand what exactly was happening between the East and the West, and to put that into perspective. That's why we came up with this book. So this is part of the things that we have been doing. We have a lot of documentation. There is a colleague of ours who started with the Residenzpflicht many years ago. And our website is full of a lot of documentation. This has become also very prime, that people can have a literature they can refer to, that people can find us because of also the things that we are trying, the history we are trying to build, our own history in this country. This is so important for us. This is our flyer, and it comes in very many languages because we know how it feels to be excluded from a language and how difficult it has been to make translation a part of what we do. We have to include translation because, of course, not being able to speak the language, we need to have the correct translation and to look for people who understand the importance of doing translation in a very political concept, not just translation because you have to change the format of the words, but from a very political perspective. And somehow with this we build allies with the Germans who are living here. It's a community that we are building. And this is what I would concretely say we are doing. We are building our own communities, not excluding anybody. And for me, this is how I doing my part of trying to change this society to be a better place to live in. I have no options. If I don't fight, then what becomes of me? I become, I begin to disappear. And what happens when I disappear? The more I get abused. So I, say, hey, I'm here. Shut the fuck up because I'm here. And what will you do? I am here. To rub it in and say, hey, yeah, I exist.